There is a man in the oldest book of the Bible who had everything. And the first thing you need to understand about him before the suffering begins, before the losses pile up, before the questions start, is that he deserved none of what was about to happen to him. That is the premise that makes the book of Job the most unsettling, most honest, and most necessary book in all of Scripture. We are introduced to Job not as a flawed man being disciplined, not as a proud man being humbled, not as a backslidden believer being called back to faithfulness. We are introduced to Job as a man about whom God himself says, "There is no one on earth like him." The Bible's description of Job in the opening verses is remarkably precise. He was blameless. He was upright. He feared God. He turned away from evil. These are not the words of Job's own self-assessment. These are God's words. The divine narrator's introduction of this man is a four-part declaration of extraordinary moral and spiritual integrity. And then, immediately after establishing who Job was, the text gives us what Job had: 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, a very large household, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And this closing line, delivered with unmistakable weight: he was the greatest of all the people of the East. By every measure available in the ancient world, and frankly, by every measure available in the modern American world as well, Job had it all: wealth, family, reputation, health, and a genuine and deep relationship with the God who had given him all of it. But here is the detail that separates Job from a simple prosperity story. The detail that tells you everything about who this man actually was beneath the abundance. Every time his sons and daughters finished a cycle of feasting together, Job would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings for each of them. Not because he had witnessed any specific sin, not because any of them had come home stumbling, but because Job thought, what if? In their hearts, my children have sinned and cursed God without even knowing it. Every single feast cycle, every single time, Job rose before dawn and stood between his children and any possible breach in their relationship with God, offering sacrifice on their behalf, just in case. Think about what that tells you about this man. He was not performing religion for social standing. He was not making sacrifices to maintain his prosperous reputation. He was a father on his knees in the dark, before the sun rose, interceding for his children with the careful tenderness of a man who understood that everything he had was a gift, and that the God who gave it deserved more than casual acknowledgement. This was not a man who feared God because God had blessed him. He feared God in the midst of blessing because that is who he fundamentally was. This matters enormously for what comes next, because the American church has largely absorbed, in one form or another, a version of Christianity that runs on a very simple transactional logic: obey God and prosper, sin and suffer. It is the theology of Job's friends before they ever opened their mouths in the story. The assumption that circumstances are always a direct and legible communication from God about the moral condition of the person experiencing them. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. If you are suffering, look for your sin. If you are prospering, keep doing what you are doing. Job's story destroys that theology from its very first sentence. Before a single catastrophe falls, before Job loses one sheep or one child, or one day of health, God has already established in the narrative that what is about to happen to this man has nothing to do with his sin. God does not introduce Job as a man with hidden failure. He introduces him as the most righteously faithful person on the face of the earth. And then the suffering begins, not in spite of his faithfulness, in a way that the text will gradually, devastatingly make clear because of it. There is a scene in the heavenly realm that the human characters in this story never get to see. Satan, the accuser, the adversary, presents himself before God along with other heavenly beings, and God initiates. God asks, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." God is not defending Job against a charge. He is pointing to Job with something that can only be described as divine pride. Here is my servant. Look at it. This is what I mean when I talk about a human being who chooses faithfulness. Satan's response cuts to the question that the entire book of Job exists to answer. Does Job fear God for nothing? Strip away the blessings, the prosperity, the family, the health. Remove every external reward that has accompanied Job's faithfulness, and then tell me whether he still fears God. The implication is devastating that human devotion to God is always, at its root, transactional, that no one serves God out of genuine love, that everyone has a price, that Job's faithfulness is simply the spiritual behavior of a man who has been successfully rewarded for it, and that the moment the reward structure collapses, so will the faithfulness. And God, in one of the most startling, divine decisions in all of Scripture, says very well, He is in your power. Only spare his life. The hedge around Job comes down, and Satan goes out to prove his point. This is where modern American Christianity must sit with its most uncomfortable question. We have built an enormous and beautifully packaged theological framework around the idea that faithfulness to God produces good circumstances, and that God's love for us is most visible in our prosperity and health and happiness. We have worship songs built around it. We have best-selling books built around it. We have entire church cultures built around the assumption that if you are right with God, things will go well, and that if things are going badly, something in your relationship with God needs adjustment. Job's story does not negotiate with that framework. It dismantles it in the first chapter. The most faithful man on the face of the earth is about to lose everything, not because God has abandoned him, not because God is punishing him, not because his faith has a hidden flaw, but because God has so much confidence in Job's genuine, non-transactional love that he is willing to let Satan test it in the most extreme possible way. Job is not a victim of divine indifference. Job is a man whom God trusts so completely that he allows the unthinkable to happen to him, knowing that what is in Job is real enough to survive what is coming. That is not a comfortable truth. It will not fit on a motivational poster. It will not fill an arena with people who came looking for a formula for comfortable living, but it is the truth. And for every person watching this who is currently sitting in their own version of Job's ashes, bewildered, in pain, faithfully living the best life they know how to live, and watching it collapse around them, this truth is the most important thing you will hear today. Your suffering is not evidence that God has forgotten you. It may be evidence that He knows exactly who you are, and He is about to show you and show all of heaven something about what is inside you that neither you nor anyone else has ever fully seen before. The losses are coming. In the next chapter, they arrive all at once. But before we get there, hold this picture in your mind. A man on his knees in the dark before sunrise, offering sacrifice for children who may not even need it, because his love for God and his love for his family will not let him rest in comfort when intercession is possible. That is the man who is about to be tested. That is the man who is about to lose everything. And that man's response to the losing will be one of the most extraordinary things any human being has ever said in the history of recorded prayer. There are moments in a life when time divides, before and after. The day everything changed. You know what I mean. You may have your own such day, the phone call, the diagnosis, the accident, the discovery, the conversation that rewrote everything that came before it and everything that would come after. Job's day arrived without warning, and it arrived with a ferocity that strains the mind's ability to process it, even as a reader of ancient text, let alone as the man living through it. 4 messengers, 4 catastrophes, each one arriving before the last had finished delivering his news. The first came while the previous words were still forming in the air. Oxen plowing, donkeys grazing, suddenly, a raid from the east. The animals taken, the servants killed by the sword. Only this messenger escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, another arrived. Fire fell from the sky. The sheep, all 7,000 of them, consumed. The servants tending them burned. Only this one escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, another arrived. 3 raiding parties. The 3,000 camels gone. The servants killed. Only this one escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, the 4th arrived. The 4th was different. The 4th was the one that no parent can hear without something in them permanently breaking. Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house. It fell upon the young people. They are dead, all of them. Only I have escaped to tell you, all 10 of his children, in a single moment, while they were together, gathered in the oldest brother's house, the kind of family gathering that Job had prayed over and offered sacrifices for. The very kind of occasion that had made him rise before dawn to stand between his children and any possible danger. They were together, and they died together. And a man who had just received 3 devastating reports of financial destruction in the space of a few minutes now received the news that no wealth and no recovery and no amount of divine blessing could ever simply fix. Job stood up. He tore his robe, the ancient gesture of grief so complete that it had to be expressed physically, because grief, that size cannot stay inside a body without breaking it. He shaved his head. He fell to the ground. And there, facing the dirt, in the wreckage of everything he had spent his lifetime building and loving and holding with open hands, Job worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Stop. Before we move past these words, we have to sit inside them for a moment. Because the instinct when reading this passage is to hear Job's response as a kind of spiritual automatism, the trained reaction of a deeply religious man whose faith kicked in before the full weight of the loss landed. It is tempting to read, "Blessed be the name of the Lord," as a defense mechanism, a practiced religious phrase that creates distance from the unbearable reality. But that would be a mistake, because Job is not creating distance from the reality. He is standing in the middle of it, in the ash and the grief and the full devastation of a man who has just lost 10 children in one afternoon. And he is choosing with everything he has to hold on to the God who gave and the God who took. This is not easy faith. This is not comfortable faith. This is the faith of a man who has been stripped of everything except God, who has nothing left to hold except the name that blessed him in the first place, and who in the very worst moment of his human life finds that holding that name is still possible, still real, still true. The American church often presents this kind of response as the model, the gold standard of suffering faithfulness, and it is extraordinary. But we need to be honest about something. Job's response in chapter 1 is only the beginning of the story. Job will not maintain this composed worship posture through everything that follows. He will break. He will question. He will rage. He will demand answers. And all of that is also in the Bible. All of that is recorded without condemnation, which means that the faith God honors in suffering is not only the faith that immediately blesses his name, it is also the faith that keeps wrestling with him through the long, dark, answerless months when blessing his name feels almost impossible. But in this moment, this first, shattering, incomprehensible moment, Job did something that even the adversary who had challenged his integrity could not dismiss. He held on. With nothing left to hold except God's name, he held on. And then it got worse. God and Satan meet again. God points to Job again. Look at my servant. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. Satan responds, skin for skin. Everything a man has, he will give for his life. Touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And God extends the permission further. Job himself only spared his life. Satan departed and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. The man who had owned 7,000 sheep was now sitting in the ashes outside the city in the refuse heap, scraping his own infected skin with a broken piece of pottery. The same hands that had offered burnt offerings for his children were now holding a piece of broken ceramic, trying to get temporary relief from the relentless burning of wounds that covered his entire body, from head to foot, not one place spared. His wife, who had shared the loss of all 10 children, who had watched her household collapse in a single day, who was processing her own grief through the lens of watching her husband disintegrate in the ash heap, looked at him and said the most human, most heartbroken, most theologically catastrophic thing anyone could say. Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. This is not a cruel woman. This is a woman who is watching someone she loves suffer beyond human bearing, and who has concluded that whatever this God is doing, it is not worth the continued suffering of the man she loves. Her counsel is the counsel of despair. End it. Curse God and get it over with. Job's response is gentle and direct. You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God? And shall we not receive evil? The text adds in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Not with his lips. That qualifier is careful and important. What was happening in his chest in the hours that followed, and the long nights ahead that would be more complicated. But in this moment, Job chose the harder thing. He chose to stay in the pain and keep facing toward God. 3 friends heard what had happened. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They came from their respective places, having agreed to go and console and comfort Job. They lifted their eyes from a distance and did not recognize him. The man they had known was gone, replaced by this barely recognizable figure in the ashes. And they did something that these 3 men, whatever their failures later in the story, deserve full credit for in this moment. They wept. They tore their robes. They threw dust on their heads toward heaven. And then they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word, because they saw that his suffering was very great. 7 days of silence. This may be the single most valuable pastoral insight in the entire book of Job, and it arrives before any of the theology begins. The most powerful thing Job's friends did in this entire narrative was the thing they did before they spoke. They came. They stayed. They sat on the ground with him in the ash heap. They made his grief their own, and for 7 days said nothing at all. Because sometimes, often, the most important ministry available to a person in maximum suffering is not an answer. It is not a theological explanation. It is not a carefully crafted word of consolation. It is about a presence. A person who is willing to sit in the ash with you and say nothing. because they understand that the pain is larger than any sentence, and that what you need right now is not someone to explain the situation, but someone to refuse to leave it. Job's friends got this completely right before they got it completely wrong, and the order matters. When the words finally come in the next chapter of this story, the words will be the disaster, but the silence was perfect. The silence was exactly what Job needed, and the suffering continued into the long darkness ahead. After 7 days of silence, Job opened his mouth, and what came out was not a composed theological statement. It was not a worship song. It was not the careful, qualified language of a man managing his grief for public consumption. What came out of Job's mouth after 7 days of holding everything inside was the rawest, most unguarded, most completely human cry in the entire Bible. It cursed the day he was born, not metaphorically, not poetically at a comfortable distance. He called on those who curse the day to curse it, those who are skilled to rouse up Leviathan. Let that day be darkness. Let God above not seek it. Let no light shine on it. Why did I not die at birth? Why did the knees receive me? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept. I would have been at rest. The thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease. I have no quiet. I have no rest. But trouble comes. These are the words of a man who has been stripped of everything and who has sat in silence for 7 days, with the full weight of the loss pressing down on him without relief. The cry is not a loss of faith. It is faith in its most honest and unfiltered form. It is the sound of a man who is still in relationship with God, who is still speaking toward heaven, rather than simply turning his back on it, expressing the truth of where he is, with a completeness that most of us never allow ourselves. Here is something the American church needs to hear very plainly. Job's lament does not earn God's rebuke. At the end of this entire story, when God finally speaks and delivers his verdict on how the different characters have handled the crisis, God does not look at Job's 35 chapters of questions and complaints and raw grief and say, "You were wrong to speak this way." He says the opposite. He says to Job's friends, the ones who delivered polished theological arguments, that they did not speak what is right about God as Job did. Job's honest wrestling, his unguarded grief, his demand for answers, his refusal to perform composure. He didn't have all of it, was more acceptable to God than the carefully constructed theological defenses his friends offered. This is a truth that carries enormous weight for every believer who has been taught, explicitly or implicitly, that expressing deep anguish or honest doubt before God is a sign of weak or sinful faith. The book of Job refuses that teaching from beginning to end. God does not want your managed version of suffering. He does not need you to protect his reputation by pretending your pain is smaller than it is, or your questions less sharp than they actually feel. He wants the truth. He receives the truth. He honors the truth. But before the honest expression of grief can be honored, it has to first survive the people in the room. And this is where Job's story moves from the extraordinary to the deeply familiar. Because after the 7 days of silence, which were golden, Job's friends opened their mouths, and the golden silence became something else entirely. Eliphaz spoke first. His speech is a masterpiece of religious sophistication wrapped around a deeply damaging core assumption. He speaks with sympathy initially. He acknowledges Job's past goodness, his instruction of many, his strengthening of weak hands, and then he pivots. Think now who that was innocent ever perished. Where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. The argument is elegant, and the theology is ancient. You are suffering because something is wrong. There is a hidden cause. Find it, confess it, and God will restore you. This is not a cruel argument. Eliphaz is not a bad man. He is a man working from a theological framework that makes the universe sensible and God's actions predictable. And that framework requires that suffering always have a moral explanation. If you are suffering, you have done something that caused the suffering. The remedy is confession and repentance. It is neat. It is logical. It is the kind of theology that produces stable, manageable religious systems. And in the case of Job, it is completely wrong. Bildad follows with an argument even blunter. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children sinned against him, he delivered them into the hand of their transgression. The implication is breathtaking in its cruelty. Your children may have deserved what happened to them. If Job will only seek God and plead with the Almighty, if he is pure and upright, God will restore him. The logic is the same as Eliphaz's, only delivered with less sympathy and more certainty. Zophar is the bluntest of the three. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. In other words, whatever you are suffering, Job, you actually deserve worse. If only you had directed your heart rightly and stretched out your hands toward God. If you had put iniquity far from your hand, then you could lift up your face without blemish. 3 men, 3 speeches, 3 variations on a single theme. You are responsible for what is happening to you. Find the sin, fix the sin. God will fix the circumstances. The theology is logical. The delivery ranges from sympathetic to brutal, and all 3 of them are completely, devastatingly wrong. The damage this kind of theology does to suffering people is enormous and well documented. It is not ancient. It is happening today in hospitals and living rooms and church counseling offices across America. It is the voice that says, if you had enough faith, the cancer would be healed. It is the voice that says you must be holding on to some unforgiven sin, or God would have answered your prayer by now. It is the voice that says if you tithe faithfully and pray correctly and keep the right spiritual disciplines, God is obligated to keep tragedy at a distance. And when tragedy arrives anyway, as it does, as it will, as it must, because we live in a broken world, that voice says you must have failed somewhere. Look harder. The fault is in you. Job hears this from the 3 people who came specifically to comfort him. And his response across chapter after chapter of impassioned reply is not capitulation. He does not accept their framework. He does not search himself and produce a confession to satisfy their theological requirements. He pushes back. He defends his integrity. He insists that the connection they are drawing between his suffering and his sin does not exist. And crucially, he does not defend himself simply to silence them. He defends himself because he is going to take his case directly to God. He is going to bypass the intermediaries and their inadequate theology and get his actual answer from the only source capable of providing it. This is one of the most important things Job does in this entire story. He refuses the false theology, even when it comes from friends, even when it comes with warmth and sophistication and centuries of religious tradition behind it, even when accepting it would have been socially easier and theologically tidier. Job looks at the framework his friends have offered him, the framework that requires him to be guilty in order for the universe to make sense. And he says, no, that is not my story. And I am going to find out what my actual story is. The silence from heaven was going to stretch across 35 chapters. It was going to feel at times like abandonment. Job would say things in that silence that are raw enough to make comfortable Christians deeply uncomfortable. He would demand to be heard. He would challenge God to answer him. He would wish he had never been born. He would say that God has made him a target, that he is watching him without mercy, that he cannot find him no matter which direction he turns, and God would let him say all of it, because the silence is not indifference. The silence is preparation. Something is coming out of the whirlwind, and it will be worth every moment of the long, dark, ash-covered waiting. Job had said everything he had to say. He had defended his integrity across chapter after chapter of passionate, grief-soaked argument. He had refused his friends' framework, challenged their theology, pleaded his innocence, described the full scope of his suffering, and demanded that God answer him. He had expressed grief so raw it had made his friends shift uncomfortably and double down on their accusations. He had wished he had never been born and declared that he could find no access to the God he had served for his entire life. He had said, "I cry to you, and you do not answer me. I stand, and you only look at me." The silence from heaven had stretched across the entire length of the dialogue. God had not interrupted, had not corrected, had not offered a quiet word of assurance to tide Job over, had simply let the darkness run its full course. And when all the voices in the ash heap had finally exhausted themselves, when Job's friends had delivered their speeches, and Job had answered each one and the young man, Elihu had added his own passionate contribution to the theological debate. The silence was finally, at last, broken, but not the way anyone in that ash heap was expecting. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the whirlwind, not in a whisper, not in a gentle, still, small voice, not in a dream or a vision or through the mouth of a prophet with a comforting message carefully calibrated to Job's emotional needs. Out of a whirlwind. The language is deliberately overwhelming. The manner of God's arrival is not pastoral. It is cosmic. The God who had been silent through 35 chapters of human wrestling with the most difficult question in theology. Why does the righteous suffer? Arrived, not with a carefully reasoned answer, but with a storm. And he began to speak. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. These are God's first words to Job after everything, after the losses, after the ash heap, after the sores and the friends and the months of silence and the 35 chapters of unanswered questions. Not, I know this has been hard. Not, here is the explanation you have been waiting for. Not, let me tell you about the conversation that happened in the heavenly council before any of this started. God's first words are a challenge, a series of questions, a relentless, beautiful, overwhelming tour of creation that begins with the foundations of the earth and does not stop for 4 full chapters. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Have you entered into the springs of the sea? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the cords of Orion? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Do you give the horse his might? Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars? Does the eagle mount up at your command? For 4 chapters, God answers Job's questions with questions. He provides not a single direct answer to any of the specific questions Job has raised. He does not explain why the suffering happened. He does not reveal the details of the heavenly dialogue that set the whole sequence of events in motion. He does not offer a theological justification for what he permitted. He simply, if the word simply can be applied to 4 chapters of cosmic revelation, describes the world he made and sustains and governs with a scope and a specificity and a power that makes every human category of understanding feel very, very small. This is the moment that has divided readers of Job for 3,000 years. Is God dodging the question? Is this a divine deflection answering human suffering not with comfort or explanation, but with an overwhelming display of power that essentially says, I am God and you are not, so stop asking? There are readers who have concluded exactly that, who have found God's speech from the whirlwind unsatisfying, even troubling a cosmic because I said so, delivered with weather effects. But look at what happens to Job when God speaks. Not what he says yet, but what happens to him in the receiving of these words. The man who had been unable to find God for months, who had said, I go forward and he is not there, backward. But I cannot perceive him that man suddenly has exactly what he was looking for and demanding and refusing to give up the search for. God, present, personal, speaking to him by name. The content of what God said was secondary to the fact that God said it at all. Job had not wanted answers as much as he had wanted presence. He had not wanted a theological explanation as much as he had wanted to know that God was still there, that the silence was not absence, that the darkness was not abandonment, that the God he had served for his entire life and who had seemed to disappear in the worst months of it was still real and still engaged and still knew his name. And God's first word out of the whirlwind addressed itself directly to Job. Not a general announcement, not a statement for the friends to hear. The Lord spoke to Job. Whatever else we say about the speech from the whirlwind, we cannot miss this: God showed up in the specific, personal, undeniable way that cuts through all of the theology and all of the arguments and all of the months of silence and says, I am here. I have been here. You wanted me to answer you. I am answering you. There's a profound and important distinction between what Job needed and what Job thought he needed. Job thought he needed an explanation. He had constructed his entire extended lament around the demand for a legal hearing, for the opportunity to present his case before God and receive a verdict that would either confirm his guilt or vindicate his innocence. He wanted the cosmic courtroom to convene. He wanted the record set straight. He wanted to understand why. What he received was not an explanation. What he received was an encounter. And the encounter, the overwhelming whirlwind scale revelation of the God who was managing every detail of a universe, so vast and complex and intricate that Job's suffering, as real and as devastating as it was part of something that extended far beyond Job's ability to comprehend. That encounter did what no explanation could have done. It didn't answer Job's question. It transformed it. It took the question, why did this happen to me, and placed it inside a context so much larger than Job's individual life that the question itself began to look different, not small, not dismissed, but relocated inside a frame that Job could not have constructed from the ash heap. God was not saying your suffering doesn't matter. God was saying your suffering is happening inside a story that is bigger than your ability to read it from where you are sitting. You are looking at one thread of a tapestry that you cannot see the full extent of. And the one who designed the tapestry, who hung every star in its place and named every constellation, and tells the ocean where to stop, and keeps the dawn arriving on schedule. That one is also the one who knows your name and came out of a whirlwind specifically to speak to you. When you had been searching for him across 35 chapters of grief and silence. The answer to suffering is not always an explanation. Sometimes, often, it is a presence, and presence, when it is the presence of the one who made everything and sustains everything, and knows every detail of every life he has made presence. Like that is enough. It is more than enough. It is the only thing that was ever going to be enough. The whirlwind had spoken. The 4 chapters of cosmic revelation had run their course, and now the silence was different from the silence of the previous months. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of aftermath. The silence that follows something so vast that the human voice needs time before it can form any response at all. And Job spoke, "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." These may be the most theologically rich and emotionally complex words in the entire book of Job. And they require careful reading because they are easy to misread in ways that do real damage to the truth Job is communicating. First, Job is not confessing sin here. This is critical, and it is frequently misread. The word translated repent does not necessarily carry the modern evangelical connotation of confessing specific moral failure. Job is not suddenly agreeing with his friends. He is not saying, "You were right, I must have sinned, here is my confession." God will explicitly reject that interpretation in the very next verses, when he tells Eliphaz that the friends did not speak what is right about God as Job did. If Job had spent the whirlwind speech discovering that he was guilty all along, God's verdict on the friend's accusation would not make any sense. What Job is turning from the word can carry the sense of changing direction. Reconsidering is his limited perspective. He is acknowledging that the framework he had been operating from, even in his honest grief and righteous demands, was too small. He had been asking the right questions, but asking them from a position that assumed he was capable of fully understanding the answers if God would only provide them. The whirlwind had shown him something about the scale of what God is managing that made him understand for the first time that the explanation he had been demanding was not the kind of thing that fits inside a human conversation. Not because God was hiding it, but because the reality it would describe is too large for the categories available to a man sitting in ashes. And then there's the sentence that is the center of everything. "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." Sit with this for a moment. Job had known God before all of this happened. He was the most faithful man on the face of the earth. He had offered sacrifices daily. He had feared God with a consistency and depth that God himself had held up as the gold standard of human devotion. He had prayed for his children, managed his household with integrity, and walked in genuine righteousness for his entire adult life. He knew God. He had heard of God. He had lived his whole life in relationship with a God he genuinely loved. But now, after the losses, after the ash heap, after the 7 days of silence and the 35 chapters of wrestling and the long darkness of divine silence, now his eye sees God. Not hears, sees. The distinction Job draws between these two modes of knowing is not a condemnation of his earlier faith. It is a description of what the suffering has done that nothing else could have done. It has moved him from a faith that was genuine but second-hand received, inherited, built on the testimony of others, and the traditions of his culture, to a faith that is first-person, direct, immediate, and unmediated. He has met God, not just believed in God, not just served God, met him in the whirlwind, after everything. This is the extraordinary and deeply counterintuitive truth that the book of Job places at its theological center. The suffering that Job experienced, the very suffering that looked from every human vantage point Like the destruction of a good man's life produced something in Job that all the years of comfortable, faithful, prosperous living had not been able to produce. A direct, personal, first-person encounter with the living God. Not better circumstances. Not a reward for faithful endurance, but God himself, known more deeply, more personally, more immediately than Job had ever known him in 40 years of righteous living. This is the answer that sits beneath the book of Job. Not an answer to why Job suffered. Not a theological explanation of innocent suffering that resolves the intellectual problem once and for all, but the revelation of what God can do in a human life through suffering that he cannot do any other way. The deepest knowledge of God, not knowledge about God, but the first-hand encounter with the actual living God. That knowledge lives on the other side of the kind of loss that strips everything away and leaves nothing but God to hold on to. There is someone watching this right now who is still in the middle of the 35 chapters, still in the long silence, still sending questions toward a heaven that has not yet answered in the way you were hoping for, still surrounded by well-meaning people offering frameworks that don't fit the shape of your actual pain. And the word from Job's response to the whirlwind is this: stay. Stay in the relationship. Keep the conversation going, however raw and unpolished and desperate that conversation sounds, because the silence is not the answer. The silence is the passage, and the whirlwind is coming. And when it comes, it will bring not the explanation you have been asking for, but something better, the first-hand, eye-level, personal presence of a God who was in the darkness with you the entire time. There is one final movement in Job's story that does not get enough attention, and it may be the most practically demanding piece of everything in this entire narrative. Before the restoration came, before the new flocks and the new children and the 140 years of flourishing that would follow, God gave Job a specific assignment. He spoke to Eliphaz and said, "Go to my servant Job, take 7 bulls and 7 rams, offer them as a burnt offering, and Job, my servant Job, will pray for you. For I will accept his prayer not to deal with you according to your folly. Let that land in its full weight." Job's restoration was preceded by the requirement that Job intercede for the people who had made his worst days worse. The friends who came to comfort and delivered months of theological accusation instead. The people who told him, in the middle of maximum grief, that his dead children may have deserved their fate. The voices that demanded confession from a man who had nothing to confess. God said, "Pray for them. Be the one through whose prayer their relationship with me is restored." This is one of the harder invitations in all of Scripture, and it is also one of the most important, because the text is careful about the sequence of what follows when Job prayed for his friends. The Lord restored Job's fortunes. The praying came first. The restoration followed the intercession. The man who had every human reason to harbor bitterness toward the people who wounded him in his most vulnerable season was invited first to stand in the gap for them before God. This pattern is not punitive. God is not withholding Job's restoration as a test of willingness to forgive. He is inviting Job into the most complete expression of the transformation that the ash heap has produced. The man who walked into the suffering was a man defined by what he had, by the flocks, the family, the reputation, the blessed life that God had surrounded him with. The man who walked out of the suffering, having seen God face to face in the whirlwind, was a man defined by something that no catastrophe could take: a first-hand encounter with the living God, and a capacity for grace toward those who had failed him that he could only have received from that encounter. The praying for his friends was not the price of restoration. It was the evidence that the restoration of the interior life had already happened. What came next was simply its outward expression. And then the Lord restored the fortunes of Job. He gave him twice as much as he had before. 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 female donkeys, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And his daughters, the text pauses here to tell us, were the most beautiful women in all the land. And Job gave them an inheritance among their brothers, which was deeply countercultural in the ancient world. A quiet sign that this man had been changed at the level of how he valued what he had been given. And Job lived 140 more years and saw his children and his grandchildren, 4 generations. And Job died, old and full of days. The restoration is real. It is abundant. It is deliberately and specifically more than what was taken. This is not a story that ends in ashes. This is a story that ends in overflowing abundance, that stands on the other side of the deepest recorded loss in all of Scripture. And that is marked permanently by the knowledge that the man who received, it had been forged in a fire that nothing in his prosperous earlier life had prepared him for. But here is what we must not miss. The restoration is not the point of Job's story. The restoration is not what makes this narrative worth telling across 3,000 years of human history. Job's friends had promised restoration if Job would only confess and turn. They were using the promise of restoration as a lever to produce confession, and God rejected everything they said. The restoration came not as the reward for confession, not as the outcome of correct spiritual performance, but as the gift that follows genuine encounter. The sequence matters. See God, intercede for those who wronged you, then receive what has been prepared for you, not the other way around. And the most important thing Job received in all of it, the most irreplaceable, most permanent, most valuable thing that came out of the worst experience of his life, was not the new sheep or the new children or the 140 additional years. It was the sentence at the center of his response to the whirlwind. Now my eye sees you. That knowledge cannot be taken away. That encounter cannot be stripped by any subsequent catastrophe. A man who has heard of God can lose his faith when the circumstances that supported it collapse. A man whose eye has seen God carries something that no ash heap and no whirlwind and no loss of any kind can touch, because it was the ash heap that produced it. There is someone watching this right now who is sitting in their own ash heap. Maybe it literally resembles Job's. Maybe the losses have been stacking up in ways that have left you breathless, each one arriving before you have finished processing the one before it. A health diagnosis that came while you were still grieving a relationship. A financial collapse that arrived in the middle of a family crisis. A loss upon a loss upon a loss, with no space between them for breath or recovery. Maybe from the outside your life looks relatively intact. The job is still there. The family is still there. The Sunday attendance uninterrupted. But inside, in the place that nobody sees, there is an ash heap. The faith that was once vivid and certain has gone quiet. The prayers that used to feel like conversation have started feeling like speaking into a room you are no longer sure anyone is in. The God who used to feel close and real and personally engaged with your life has somewhere in the past months or years gone silent in a way that is beginning to feel less like sacred mystery and more like absence. Both of those people, the one whose losses are visible and the one whose ash heap is entirely interior, are Job. And the message the book of Job carries for both of them is the same. Your suffering is not evidence of your failure. Let that land fully, because the voices around you, well-meaning voices, religious voices, voices that love you and are genuinely trying to help, are very likely delivering some version of the message Job's friends delivered. If you had more faith, if you would just trust God more completely. If there is some sin you need to confess. If you tithe faithfully. If you pray correctly. If you keep the right spiritual disciplines in the right order, the suffering will lift and the restoration will come. That framework is as ancient as Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, and it is as wrong today as it was the day it was delivered in the ash heap outside the city. God's anger burned against those friends, not because they were evil, not because they were deliberately trying to wound Job, but because they spoke about God things that were not right. And the not rightness of what they said caused damage to a suffering person that silence would never have caused. The 7 days before they opened their mouths were perfect. The months of theological argument that followed were disastrous. And the particular disaster of their theology was this: it made Job's suffering, at its root, about Job's failure. It located the cause of the darkness in the person enduring the darkness. If you are in your ash heap today, hear this directly and without qualification. The fact that you are suffering does not mean that God is angry with you. It does not mean that your faith is insufficient. It does not mean that there is a hidden sin in your life that is blocking divine blessing. It may mean, and the book of Job says this plainly, that you are precisely the person God trusts enough to endure the kind of darkness that produces the deepest possible knowledge of who he actually is. The most faithful man on the face of the earth sat in ashes, and God never stopped calling him my servant. Job's long silence from heaven was not abandonment. God had not moved. God had not looked away. God was present in every single day of the suffering, tracking every moment of it, engaged with every grief and every question, and every raw, unguarded cry that Job sent toward a heaven that appeared to have gone dark. The silence was not the absence of God. It was the condition under which God was doing something in Job that could not be done any other way, something that required the full length of the darkness to produce. And when the silence broke, when the whirlwind came, and God spoke, Job did not receive a comfortable explanation. He received something infinitely better. He received God, personally, directly, without any mediating layer of theology or tradition or secondhand testimony. Your silence may not be over yet. The whirlwind may not have arrived. You may be somewhere in the middle of the long darkness, still asking why, still searching for a presence you cannot seem to locate, still holding on to a faith that feels like it is being gripped from the wrong end with both hands and the wrong half of your strength. If that is where you are, then hear this from Job's story. The silence is not the final word. The whirlwind is coming, and when it comes, it will not bring the explanation you have been asking for. It will bring something better. It will bring God in a way you have never encountered him before, in a way that only the ash heap could have prepared you to receive. Hold on. Keep speaking toward heaven even when heaven seems silent. Keep the conversation going even when the conversation is raw and desperate and does not sound like the prayers you were taught to pray in Sunday school. Because the faith that God honors in this story is not the polished faith of careful theological argument. It is the stubborn, refuse to let go, 35 chapters of honest, wrestling faith of a man who never stopped directing his questions toward the God he could not find but could not stop seeking. And do not be afraid of your questions. Do not muffle them in the name of protecting God's reputation or maintaining an appearance of spiritual composure for the people around you. Job's questions were the most honest thing in the room. His questions were what God called, speaking of me, what is right. The faith that pretends everything is fine when everything is not fine. The faith that manages suffering for public presentation. The faith that says, "Blessed be the name of the Lord," through clenched teeth, while secretly resenting the Lord and never admitting it to anyone, including God, that faith is less like Job's faith and more like the faith of his friends. And we know how God received the friends. Bring your real questions. Bring your actual grief. Bring the version of yourself that is exhausted and confused and cannot find God and is starting to wonder whether the whole framework is real. Bring that person to the ash heap and let God meet that person there, because that is the person God met in the whirlwind. Not the composed, theologically articulate, correctly formatted version. The actual Job, the man in the ashes with sores on his skin and grief in his chest and questions he had been screaming at an apparently empty sky for 35 chapters. That man was called my servant. 4 times in the final chapter, God calls him that. My servant Job. The man who cursed the day he was born. The man who demanded a legal hearing before the divine court. The man who said, I cry to you and you do not answer. My servant. The one I am proud of. The one who spoke of me what is right. The book of Job ends with a restoration so abundant that it feels almost excessive. Twice as many animals as before. 7 new sons and 3 new daughters. And the daughters, the detail the text leans into with unusual specificity, were the most beautiful women in all the land. And their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers, 140 more years of living, long enough to see 4 generations of descendants, to watch the story continue and multiply and bear fruit beyond anything the ash heap had suggested was possible. God gives back. Not what was taken. The 10 children who died are not replaced by these new 10, and Job's grief for the ones he lost was not canceled by the ones who came after. But God gives abundantly, generously, beyond the edge of what Job had before, into territory that the man sitting in the refuse heap outside the city could not have imagined from the ground. This is the God of the beautiful ending. Not the God who explains suffering before it happens or provides a satisfying theological framework while it is happening. Not the God who guarantees that the darkness will be short or that the silence will be brief or that the questions will all receive answers before the whirlwind speaks. But the God who is present in the ash heap and active in the silence and who holds the end of every story in hands, large enough to encompass the vastness of creation, and personal enough to know the name of every man sitting alone in the ashes of his own life. He gave. He took. He gave again more than before, different from before, deeper than before. Blessed be his name in the giving. Blessed be his name in the taking. And blessed be his name in the returning, when the abundance flows back across the borders of loss, and the morning finally arrives after the longest night. But before we speak of restoration, we must speak of what came just before it, because the sequence the book of Job gives us in its final chapter contains one more piece of hard wisdom that stands between the whirlwind and the new flocks stretching to the horizon. After God spoke to Job, and Job responded, God turned to the friends. My anger burns against you, he said to Eliphaz, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Take 7 bulls and 7 rams, go to my servant Job, and offer a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept his prayer. Job's restoration was preceded by Job's intercession for the people who had wounded him most in his suffering. This is not incidental. The text makes the sequence unmistakably clear. When Job prayed for his friends, then the Lord restored Job's fortunes. The praying for the friends was not a condition placed on the restoration as a test of spiritual worthiness. It was the natural overflow of a man who had seen God face to face, and who could no longer hold the bitterness of religious betrayal with the same grip that the old, unwhirlwinded Job might have maintained. The encounter with God had produced in Job a capacity for grace toward those who had failed him that he could not have manufactured from the ash heap on his own. The intercession was not Job paying a price. It was Job demonstrating in the most concrete and costly way available that the transformation the suffering had worked in him was complete. There is a word here for everyone who has been wounded by a religious community, and that category is far larger than most church communities acknowledge. The person whose grief was met with theological accusation instead of compassionate presence. The one who was told, in the middle of their worst season, that their suffering must be connected to their sin. The believer who came to the body of Christ in need of the 7 days of silent sitting with, and received instead the months of Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. If that is your story, if some version of the 3 friends has been in your ash heap, then Job's final chapter has something difficult and important to say to you. The path to your full restoration may run through your intercession for the people who failed you, not because God is being unkind in requiring it, not because your hurt was not real or the damage they did was not significant, but because the bitterness that outlasts the suffering, the specific corrosive bitterness of having been wounded by religious people who were supposed to help, is itself an ash heap. And the God who met Job in his ash heap of loss is the same God who wants to meet you in that one. Praying for the people who hurt you in your suffering is not the same as saying what they did was acceptable. It is not the same as returning to a relationship that was harmful or pretending the damage was not real. It is something more specific and more powerful than either of those things. It is the decision to release them from the hold they have on your interior life, to stop letting their wrong words occupy the center of your chest, and to hand them over to the God who is better equipped to deal with them than you are. Job became the instrument of his friend's restoration with God, and in that becoming, something final was released in Job that made him capable of receiving what was waiting for him on the other side of the praying. Because you cannot fully receive abundance with hands that are clenched around an old wound. The hands that received the 14,000 sheep and the 6,000 camels and the new children and the 140 years were hands that had just been opened in intercession for people who did not deserve it. Open hands receive. Clenched hands cannot. So here is where Job's story speaks directly into your life tonight. Wherever your ash heap is, whatever form of loss or silence or religious wounding or unanswered question has brought you to this place, the God of Job is the same God who is present in your situation right now. He has not explained himself. He may not explain himself in the time frame you are hoping for or in the way you have been asking for, but he will show up. He showed up for Job in the whirlwind. He will show up for you in whatever form your particular moment of divine arrival takes. And when he does, it will not be an explanation that changes everything. It will be the presence itself. You are not abandoned. The silence is not absence. The darkness that currently surrounds you is not the final chapter of your story. It is the necessary interior of a passage that ends in light, in abundance, in the kind of first-hand knowledge of the living God that no comfortable season could have produced. Job went into the suffering as the greatest man of the East, measured by flocks and family and reputation, and the careful, faithful practice of early morning sacrifice. He came out of the suffering as a man whose eye had seen God, and he would not have traded the second thing for all the flocks in the world. Your worst season may be producing the most important knowledge of your entire life. The knowledge that no prosperity and no comfort and no years of smooth sailing could ever have given you. The first-hand, first-person, unmediated knowledge of a God who was in the darkness with you the entire time, working, present, preparing the whirlwind, already holding the end of your story in the same hands that hung the stars in their places and set the boundary of the sea. He is the God of the ash heap. He is the God of the whirlwind. He is the God who calls the most broken person in the room my servant. And he is the God of the beautiful ending, the ending that is more than what you had before, different in kind from what you imagined while you were sitting in the ashes, and marked permanently by the most valuable thing the suffering ever produced. Now my eye sees you. That is the ending. That has always been the ending, and it is more than enough.